From Harold Washington to Harold's Chicken and everything in between and beyond, SoCHiology is the exploration of Chicago culture, history, legends, stories, and fiction through a myriad of discussions with Chicagoans themselves. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of SoCHiology. Now, on the previous episode, I interviewed Jeff Spitz. He's a documentary filmmaker here in Chicago, and he's the director of the Roosevelt Experiment. The Roosevelt Experiment is a documentary about Roosevelt University, downtown Chicago, and its early years of how it was formed in the 1940s, as well as the students that attended there. One of those students was Harold Washington, who actually would become known as the student council president at Roosevelt University. Now, in this episode, please go back and listen to it when you get a chance. In this episode, I asked Jeff Spitz, how was he able to get so many interviews with a mayor of a major American city like that? Jeff Spitz was just a young 20-year-old filmmaker at the time. Jeff deduced that he believes he was able to get so much time with the mayor because it was time for Mayor Harold Washington to relax, unwind, and talk about the things that he loved. It was a break for him from the council wars. On this episode, I want to expand on what the council wars were, why they happened, and ultimately what was the result. You see, in 1983, Harold Washington defeated the incumbent mayor of Chicago, Jane Byrne, at the time, as well as the state's attorney at the time, Richard M. Daley, who would become the mayor himself in the 1990s. But nonetheless, it was a racially polarized election, and it caught national attention. Once Harold Washington won, you assume that he would have majority of the city council on his side, because as a Democrat in a Democratic city, the Democratic machine, as it's called here in Chicago, you would have everybody as your allies, you would think. That wasn't the case with Harold Washington. You see, two aldermen known as the Eddies. You had Ed Verdoliak of the 10th Ward and Ed Burke of the 14th Ward. They were known as the Eddies, and they formed a voting bloc known as the Verdoliak 29. The Verdoliak 29 would cause hell, and they started the council wars. It was formed of 28 white men and one Hispanic man. They appointed themselves as the leaders of every single committee in the city, and they would block all of the mayor's appointments. So even though he named somebody as the head of a certain department, they couldn't have the official title. They were just interims. Other prominent members of the Verdoliak 29 was Richard Mell of the 33rd Ward and Fred Rhodey of the 1st Ward, who had heavily mob ties. Even though the Verdoliak 29 had enough power to cancel and block the mayor's appointments, they didn't have enough power to override his veto. You need 2/3, and 2/3 of 50 council members is 33. It was only 29 of them. So for 3 years, they was ingrained in a deep council war, back and forth, a lot of heated discussions and city council meetings. But it was in 1986 when Mayor Harold Washington's allies sued in federal court to have the census redrawn because they felt it was unfair and displacing a lot of Black and Hispanic voters. And in Mayor Harold Washington's favor, they ruled on the Allied side. And as a result, 6 special elections was held. And in these elections, 3 of Mayor Harold Washington's supporters won elections. And it was Luis Gutierrez who won his election in the 32nd Ward that gave Harold Washington 25 aldermen on his side. Now, the 25 and 25, it was a deadlock. But Mayor Harold Washington had the deciding 26th vote, thus ending the council wars. After that, Richard Mell, who was a strong member of the Verdoliak 29, switched sides and said that he would support Mayor Harold Washington going forward. Ed Verdoliak would eventually run in the mayoral election against Harold Washington in 1987, and he would lose. Mayor Harold Washington would win his second term. The council wars were officially over. But unfortunately, later that year, Mayor Harold Washington's untimely death put an end to his tenure. So what was the aftermath of the council wars, you ask? Well, Fred Rhodey of the 1st Ward was indicted on racketeering and bribery charges in 1993. He died in 1999. Ed Verdoliak of the 10th Ward was indicted on bribery and racketeering charges in 2007, and he served 10 months in federal prison in 2010. He was indicted again in 2016 on tax evasion. Ed Burke is the longest serving alderman in Chicago history. He is still currently the alderman of the 14th Ward, but he's set to stand trial in November of 2023 for bribery and racketeering charges himself. And as for Harold Washington, his legacy still looms large here in Chicago, not just for Black Chicagoans, but Chicagoans everywhere who understand what righteousness and justice and equality and equity really is. So it's safe to say Harold Washington won the council wars, and the Verdoliak 29, they lost, took an L, big time. If you enjoyed this podcast, whatever platform you're listening to it on right now, whether it be Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, etc., leave a 5-star review and a comment. Let us know what you think. And don't forget to subscribe to our sister podcast, Mogul Motivation, from True Stories Media.